2020 إلى أن مواقف وسلوك الطلاب تتأثر بشكل جوهري بمدى الدعم الذي يحصلون عليه من كل من العائلات والمعلمين. بينما شدد تقرير آخر على مدى أهمية الإدارة الجيدة في المدارس في دعم وتعزيز بيئات التعلم المساعدة للأطفال على النمو والتطور. وفي هذا السياق تعتبر أدوار المعلمين وإدارات المدارس والعائلات أثناء التعلم عن بعد بمثابة عوامل حيوية من أجل الوصول لفهم بما يخص تأثيرات الموارد التي يمكنهم الوصول إليها، علاوة على المحيط المادي والمعنوي من حولهم. الأخوة والأخوات، أن الندوة هذه بشكل أساسي تهدف إلى الوصول إلى فهم مشترك على مستوى وضع السياسات وكافة العاملين في المجال التربوي وكذلك أولياء الأمور حول الفرص والتحديات المطروحة من خلال مراحل التعلم عن بعد، كما سيتم استعراض خبرات ومعارف راسخة بما يخص السياسات التعليمية والمبادرات الناجحة في مجال التعليم عن بعد والأنظمة الداعمة لهذا النوع من التعلم. وكذلك سوف يتم استعراض في الجلسة الأولى دولة الإمارات العربية المتحدة نموذجاً للدعم الذي تقدمه الوزارات والحكومات ممثلة بوزارة التربية والتعليم في مجال إنجاح وتعزيز جودة التعلم عن بعد. الأخوة والأخوات الأفاضل، أن الندوات التربوية التي يقيمها المركز الإقليمي للتخطيط التربوي تمثل نشاطاً حيوياً ضمن الأهداف الاستراتيجية التي يسعى المركز لتحقيقها من أجل نشر المعرفة المتعلقة بالتخطيط التربوي وتيسير الانتفاع بها، وهي تمثل عملاً مؤسسياً نحرص عليه ونحسن الإعداد له من خلال دعوة المختصين والمفكرين والتربويين والعاملين في مجال التعليم لتبادل الأفكار وإجراء الحوارات التربوية للخروج برؤى وتوصيات من شأنها تطوير منظومة التعليم وتحسين مخرجاتها والإعداد لمواجهة المشكلات والتحديات في هذا القرن. نحن نتطلع من خلال هذه الندوة إلى الاستماع إلى الخبراء المشاركين، كما نتطلع أيضاً إلى المناقشات والمداخلات الهادفة للوصول إلى رؤية ومسار واضح حول دور المؤسسات والأفراد والمجتمع في تعزيز ودعم جودة التعليم عن بعد من خلال تطوير أنظمة دعم فاعلة وراسخة، ووصولاً لجيل من المبدعين الذين يمتلكون مهارات وكفاءات عالية تمكنهم من الإسهام في دفع عجلة التنمية الشاملة والمستدامة والتعايش مع متطلبات القرن ال21. وتشرف في الختام في توجيه الشكر لمعالي حسين الحمادي وزير التربية والتعليم ورئيس مجلس إدارة المركز الإقليمي للتخطيط التربوي للجهود التي يقوم بها كرئيس مجلس إدارة في دعم مسيرة المركز وتفعيل دوره وتعزيز مشاركاته وتقدير جهوده في مجال التربية والتعليم. كما توجه بالشكر أيضاً لجميع الخبراء المشاركين في هذه الندوة لعملهم وموافقتهم على مشاركتنا لخبراتهم، كما أتقدم لجميع المشاركين والحضور من على المستوى الوطني والإقليمي والعالمي والمشاركين في هذه الندوة. وأترك المجال الآن للدكتورة باتريسيا فيدالغو من كلية الإمارات للتطوير التربوي شريكنا الاستراتيجي الدائم للبدء في الجلسة الأولى من هذه الندوة. دكتور باتريسيا, the floor is for you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. His Excellency Dr. Hamad Halaye, Dr. Mahra Al-Mutawi, distinguished speakers and guests. Welcome to this seminar organized by the Regional Center for Educational Planning. We are here today to talk about strengthening the quality of remote learning through developing strong support systems. My name is Patricia Fidalgo, and I'm an associate professor at the Emirates College for Advanced Education, and I will be moderating the first session of this seminar. We have three distinguished guests in our first session: His Excellency Dr. Hamad, Dr. Cristobal Kobo, and Dr. Christer Rockings. Our first speaker is Excellency Dr. Hamad, is the Assistant Undersecretary for the Curricular Sector of the Ministry of Education of the United Arab Emirates since December 2017. Dr. Hamad has worked as a curriculum director at the ministry between 2015 and 2017 and was an assistant professor in the physics department at the United Arab Emirates University. In today's presentation, Dr. Hamad will speak about the role of the government and the Ministry of Education during the periods of remote learning. Dr. Hamad's presentation will take about 20 minutes, and I will ask our guests to mind the time of their presentations. I will raise a 5-minute warning like this, if you don't mind. For the participants, the ones who wish to pose questions to our speakers, please write the questions in the chat box. And at the end of the session, we will have a Q&A period of time. Thank you so much, Your Excellency. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for introducing me and bringing this session to the public to learn and to exchange best practices and how we support the education ecosystem to survive the pandemic and how we can move forward progressively to make sure that any unintentional gap that took place in the education system from attainment perspective point of view can be overcome, and the role of the government and the stakeholders in supporting the education system, not within the UAE only, but globally. Here in the UAE, what we have the Emirati school system. At first, the screen is can be seen, viewable to all.
Yes, we can see your screen. Thank you.
Okay. At first, I want to give a very quick overview over the education system here in UAE. What we have what's so-called the Emirati school system, and it is very visible to the audience that it starts from extremely early age, which is from 0 or before birth to 8 years old, and it continues to the lifelong journey of the learners. And you can see it, the PhD are included into the system. This system basically do take care of vocational technical education for those who are the dropout of the system, and vocational technical education for those students who are below 18 years old, and academic education for the students who are in the academic oriented or academic track. At the same time, we have what's so-called specialized academies, where those students are taking a very advanced and rigorous academic curriculum, and at the same time, they have been equipped with advanced technical skills to fulfill the expectation of the future industry. Now, during the pandemic, it's about how we can make sure all of this system can survive the pandemic and can continue in achieving the ultimate outcomes that has been designed in the curriculum before being in the pandemic. What happened is we need to keep in mind why we need to assure this system will survive, because at the end, any education system is trying to serve a strategic pillar within its context. Here in UAE, the government is having a very ambitious mission plan. We have the UAE Vision 2021, and we have the UAE Centennial, which is the plan for every strategic sector within the country on how that sector would look like from now till 2071. Basically, all of these sectors within the government would rely heavily on the education outcome, the outcome of the education system. The pandemic, it is not obvious and not clear to anyone in the world when it will finish and how we can really control it without interfering with the way that we operate and implement the education practice. This is why we need to think about bringing all of the stakeholders in the country to assure continuity of the education would be granted, and efficiency in coming back and overcoming all of the gaps, intentional or non-intentional gap, and at the same time aligning the student progression to achieve the ultimate goal of the education system within UAE or globally as well. I will skip some of the stream instead of going over the details and try to move directly into how designing an education system ecosystem, and that ecosystem basically need to make sure that all of the student records have been captured, the teaching and learning process from behavior, attainment, assessment, viewing content, and so all of it need to be captured as well. Part of this ecosystem from design perspective point of view need to be anywhere and anytime. If you look at the term of anywhere and anytime, since 2011, the government of UAE, under the program from Mohammed bin Rashid Smart Learning program, have came to the idea of how we need to equip all of the infrastructure in the country for all of the learners to be able to learn from anywhere and anytime. This is since 2011. The pandemic came in 2020, and we have a real proof of concept at scale how every single student within the ecosystem have managed to continue their learning from anywhere at any time based on a very basic, simple definition, a very basic definition in the process of designing the education system in UAE. Engagement and fulfilling what's so-called personalized based learning experience here in the UAE Centennial, part of the KPI on the education system is to assure that every single student will have a well-articulated and well-designed learning pathway for that learning. How we can assure such an ecosystem would support such a learner during the time of the pandemic, and with assuring the engagement of all of the stakeholders within the education system, or within the ecosystem of where the education system is lying. Usually we have heard a lot when we interacted with different educators from the globe. We have heard about their experience in bringing resources to the learners. Most of these resources and solutions are coming into an ISO, where the student is, for example, in taking care of a math course, he's just interacting with a math solution. If he's taking a language course, he's dealing only with a language solution. If a teacher is receiving a training, the training is not captured and in the domain where how that training is contributing into solidifying the student learning experience. Here in the UAE, we have designed a system where all of the input can be captured, and the output or the impact of that input can be measured, and at the same time we can go back in designing how the student progression or learning pathway can benefit from the input and the impact of that input on any individual within the system. It is an education solution, or the student themselves, the parents, the teachers, the school principal, the entities, for example, private sector, public sector, or semi-government, all of those, when they contribute into the education system, we have become up with an ecosystem where we capture their input, their contribution to the ecosystem, and the form of support that they put in place in the ecosystem, and the impact of that in the learner from design perspective and from the student progression or attainment perspective point of view. You can look into this simple slide of how this ecosystem is trying to take care of the parents' role, the after-school programs, the student themselves, the teacher, the school leadership, or the stakeholder at the national or local state domain, and how all of these parameters, how all of them are feeding into the giant set of data that would be collected by this ecosystem, and how that would serve the purpose of designing or fulfilling or providing a well-personalized based learning experience per each individual, and how that personalized based learning experience will contribute in building what's so-called the student portfolio. And that student portfolio would continue with the student from birth till the higher ed, or even can be utilized when the student gets into the job sector by looking into his full profile from behavior, skills, knowledge, and so on. Then this is in a nutshell, I'm trying to describe to everyone, having in design and implementation such an ecosystem, very comprehensive, that top into all of the components, would require from the Ministry of Education to engage in a very robust and solid mechanism with all of the stakeholders. And during the pandemic, the Ministry of Education have taken into consideration how we can tap on the parents and design a very designated set of training session to all of the parents from cycle 1, cycle 2, cycle 3. Cycle 1, cycle 2, cycle 3, I mean from the lower grades of primary, upper primary, and secondary education. And to assure they will know what's their role during the first part of the pandemic, because when you are turning on learning from distance at scale, not all of the parents are having the right readiness. Maybe teachers, long time ago, since 2011, they took enough training on how to utilize the ecosystem platforms, asynchronous and non-asynchronous learning. Extra dosage of training have been put in place for the teachers. But then how to activate the role of parents to assure that they will act as a supporter to the students and the teachers in fulfilling the expectation of how the students supposed to carry out their learning journey while they are during the pandemic. But this is not enough in terms of training teachers, parents, and students. The training is not limited, or the support was not limited to how to utilize or how to engage effectively with the ecosystem, but even emotionally and socially, how to comb and how to manage the process of being in 100% online-based, home-based, or within the quarantine-based education, and to overcome any emotional or social or psychological impact on the parents and teacher, and to manage the pressure of carrying out an online-based learning from, let's say, February till the end of the academic year. This is what helped us here in the UAE by engaging with all of the stakeholders and providing such a training to the parents and the teacher to start very smoothly, even though the student have not went back to school 100% in UAE, to manage a very smooth start for the academic year, for the academic year of 2021, without hearing the panic of how to manage and how to handle the pressure of taking care of the student or the kids learning while they are at home. This is how, in a nutshell, I'm trying to describe how the ecosystem have managed to fulfill its expectation and design by assuring students not from K-12 only are within the responsibility of the ecosystem of UAE, is to assure the higher ed will receive a student who have a very clear attainment level and a very clear portfolio on what the student have managed to achieve while they are learning in school during the pandemic time. Here in UAE, in terms of the design of the education system, the student have managed the system. I will go back to this element. The system have managed to bring more initiative that would serve the engagement of the learner within the learning at the pandemic time, where we have seen initiatives such as the dual credit program. Universities student in cycle 3 have managed to take courses because they have demonstrated a high college readiness and a high, very solid progression over attaining the outcome in a very short time. Then the universities start offering some university courses for these students. We have seen engagement from the industry, where those students, which I have explained at the beginning, from the applied stream, have managed to continue their mandatory 100 hours of training, part of it virtually and part of it on the job premise, while they are carrying on the online-based learning program. We have seen some policies such as the early entrance program for those students who have managed to demonstrate that they have the capability to complete the academic and skill-based and competencies earlier than the other students within their cohort to be eligible to enroll at the university level-based courses. We have seen we have very promising initiative, which is Bara'im al-Mustaqbal, where students have been able to enroll into the ecosystem of learning as early as 3 years old, officially within the education system. Here, these are the simple, or in a nutshell, the very basic initiative that has been, which we have managed to roll out to provide more and more support to the parents during the pandemic time, and to assure all of the students from as early as 3 years old are fully engaged in a very promising learning experience and learning journey while they are in the pandemic. I'm on time, Mahra? I heard a note.
No, you are still on time. Thank you.
Okay, because okay, then should I finish here or I continue?
We still have 5 more minutes.
Oh, 5 more minutes, because I hear the signal. Sorry for this. Then basically, I'm sure now the concept of having a fully integrated ecosystem that serves all of the pillars is very clear. I want to go back to very basic set of slides about the academies here in the education system here in UAE. During the pandemic time, or before the pandemic, the education system were considering having a very specialized academy to serve the students, to support the students in learning, or to have a more emphasis toward a specific domain of knowledge and skill. During the pandemic, and at the beginning of this academic year, the education system here in UAE have took the initiative of capitalizing more on the NQC-based standard, which is the National Qualification Center standard of education, and to push almost about 60 to 70%, let's say 60% of the learners within the ecosystem of education to be more into the national qualification standard from the domain of the competencies that they will acquire while they are in the education system. This is why what is unique about the education system, by the time the students are going to get back to school, or even if the pandemic is continuing, we have came up with these specialized academies in business and economics, which do bring stakeholders from higher ed and from the industry itself, from the job market. They come together and they work with the Ministry of Education to design and to create a curriculum for the students who have demonstrated an interest in business and economy. And the same thing for creative art, for sport, for health science, aviation, maintenance and culture, social studies, food and agriculture, and so many other domains. We have created specialized academies where it have managed to engage stakeholders from the industry and from the academies, from the universities, to come and to create and curate a curriculum and a learning program for students from as early as grade 9, which is at about an age of 14 years old. And some of these specialized academies, they do start earlier from the age group of grade 4 and 5. What is meant by these academies? It give an insight that within the pandemic, we need to make sure the student is not just taking care of their learning journey, but they do take care of their career, future career pathway. They need to define their interest as early as when they are from grade 4 or 5, and start taking the needed competencies and courses from academic perspective point of view or from skill perspective point of view, to assure that while they are within the K-12 system, they have a very clear intention of which job sector in the future that they will serve, or which job competencies that they need to be equipped with before getting out of the K-12 system. And at the same time, these specialized academies are acting as a pre-advising to the student on the academic. And that basically what it will do for us, it will help us to assure this acceleration will help and support the learners within the ecosystem here in UAE to complete their college program or college degree in less than 3 years while they are in the college. And that basically have helped some of the universities to design a 4 years 3+1 program or 4+1 program, which is a bachelor plus master degree for the student who are getting out of this specialized academy, as long as he's continuing into that specific specialization. You can see in a very quick description that this ecosystem is looking into the industry, engagement in supporting the learners, the higher ed institutes in supporting and designing a well-articulated vertically learning journey, the training for the parents, not to engage technically on the ecosystem in supporting their kids, but also how to support them emotionally to cope with the pressure of the online journey, of online-based learning, and at the same time activating many sort of activities such as the art and visual art curriculum, the music, the PE, and all of these set of curriculum, the theater curriculum has been activated 100% during the pandemic to release the stress on taking care only of the 4 or 5 core courses, where we have heard from many countries and nations during the pandemic, they were focusing only literacy, numeracy, and fundamental science. But here in UAE, to ease and to support the parents and the educators to keep the engagement at a high mode with the education system, to activate all of these sorts of courses, the art, the PE, the music, the visual curriculum, the coding, robotic, all of these curriculum are in active mode. At least it will assure to us that the student, when they come back to the school, the skills, the social emotional talent, and the social engagement and interaction are always going to be kept, and they would capitalize more in accelerating their learning journey by joining this specialized academy to ease their journey when they get into higher ed without the suffer of getting attrition or dropout from higher ed institute in the future, or from complete or fulfilling the expectation of not achieving the completion of higher ed within the intended timeline. This is what I want to share with the audience in this 20 minutes. I wish it was very useful information for all of them on how the education system is, from design perspective point of view, is trying to engage with all of the stakeholders in fulfilling the expectation of the education ecosystem, and to strike some gain at the student level, parents, teachers, school principal, and independent stakeholder from the education system here within the UAE. Thank you for listening, and we are open for any sort of question or feedback.
Your Excellency, Dr. Hamad, thank you very much for your insightful and very comprehensive presentation. I'm sure that the measures taken by the UAE government and the Ministry of Education during the pandemic are really remarkable and have helped the students and the families for sure to overcome the challenges of the past year. If you would agree, our Q&A session will be at the end. So I will now move to present our second speaker. And for those participants who would like to ask questions to Your Excellency, Dr. Hamad, please write them on the chat box. And now it's my pleasure to present our second speaker, Dr. Cristobal Kobo, a senior education specialist at the World Bank, focusing on effective and appropriate use of new technologies in education. Dr. Cristobal Kobo has an extensive professional experience working at the intersection of future learning, cultures of innovation, and human-centered technologies across developed and developing countries. Dr. Kobo was an associate researcher at the University of Oxford. He was also a professor and director of communications at the Latin American Social Sciences Institute in Mexico, and has served as founding director of the Center of Research at the Cibal Foundation in Uruguay. In his presentation today, Dr. Kobo will be speaking about the benefits of supportive home systems for remote learning. If you have any questions for Dr. Kobo, please write them in the chat box and we will include them at the end in the Q&A session. Dr. Kobo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Patricia. It's such a pleasure. Do you see and hear me well?
Yes, we see you and hear you very well. Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. Greetings to all the participants and my gratitude to the organizing team for bringing time for reflection in a time that it's not a normal time. It's not a normal year. Probably when the years pass, we will remember this as a special time. But also when we change times, when we change dynamics, it's such a good moment for reflection. And I think the space that today is activated is just a good opportunity for that. So I've been asked to reflect with you about the supporting home system. And I think this is such an important perspective. And I think whatever we reflect on the home supporting system, we have to put them in perspective and to ask ourselves, what are the lessons that we have gotten during 2020 and 21 that we can bring into the future of education, well connected with the excellent presentation of Dr. Hamad. But before going into that, let me start with this study. This is a study that was done a few years ago by a group of researchers from the MIT, which decided to understand how is the brain activity during different exercises and activities that we do in a normal day. So they asked this group of researchers to different people to wear wearable systems in their body while they were doing physical activities, cognitive activities, and emotional tasks. Cognitive activities such as attending a class, going and taking an exam, or doing a homework, or simply studying. And they found something very interesting. When you have a look at the different days, these different participants, during the class time, the brain activity was incredibly flat, was way more passive than when they were even sleeping. And I think that says a lot about the challenges we have in the perspective that we have to address this conversation. There are challenges that I'm not saying that this is a representative sample. I'm not saying that this is happening in every country, but in a way, it illustrates some of the questions that we have to ask when we design learning strategies. Now, having said that, I will try to address 4 questions in this 20 minutes or a little bit less. How to integrate technology and pedagogy in an effective way? What support mechanisms can be implemented? How teachers and parents can work together? And how to monitor and evaluate some of these different approaches implemented. So let me start saying that technology plays such an important role in the learning experience. But it's also fair to say that in many cases, technology, and particularly studies on the impact of technology during the learning, is not necessarily a linear correlation. In many cases, we don't see a lot of strong correlations between the implementation of technology and the learning. But what we see is when there's an ecosystem of elements, we do see transformational results. An ecosystem of elements, I will drill into that, but I would say on the basic conditions, it's critical to have what we call the enabling conditions. Obviously, access to infrastructure, connectivity, devices, contents, and platforms. But also there's a number of supportive environments that I think some of them were already mentioned, which has to do with regular feedback, communication, remedial help, tutoring and coaching, teach at the right level, training, and even providing classroom observation to maximize the quality of the learning experience. So when we think in this partnership between education and technology, all these other elements are critical to be considered. Let me show you an example. This is the roadmap of the European Union in terms of how to facilitate blended learning these days. So there are so many dimensions that they have addressed as important. But if you do a closer look, there are so many elements of those which are strictly correlated with the learning environment that today might be happening in the homes of many of the learners from our schools. And those enabling factors, or as we can call them, a network of supportive factors, have to do with the quality of the learning experience, the community support, the enrollment of the parents, and also keeping some balance in terms of the social-emotional status of the learner. So these elements might not be coming from the most traditional visions, but it's important to address them. And sometimes it's important to design strategies to monitor them and to provide additional support. Now, in this traditional relationship between the student and the teacher, now we have a third element, which I think is one of the positive sides of this pandemic, which is the role of the parents. But in each one of these cases, there's so much support that we have to consider to provide high quality experience. So we have to design strategies to be highly engaging for the students. We have to provide the learners tools for have higher level of agency and self-direction of learning, and to stimulate all these supportive conditions. But at the same time, teachers might get lost. At the same time, teachers might have some level of anxiety, or they might need some guidance in order to prioritize some of the subjects when we are teaching remotely. Luckily, and I think it's an opportunity, parents can play a role in this equation and provide very clear guidelines to parents how they can play a role here. What is the help that they can provide? How they have to manage the anxiety of the learners. If we don't take it into attention, all these elements, we might lean towards high levels of anxiety or the burnout of the teachers, or in some cases, parents who feel overwhelmed. And I think this is important to mention, because at the end of the day, we have learned that learning is not only a transactional phenomenon, but it's a relational phenomenon. So a lot has been said in the last couple of years about the importance of the containers and the contents. Container being any kind of technology, and the contents meaning the learning materials. But I think in this equation, the context will play such an important role. And I think during this pandemic, the context is the one that has been more redefined. And I think there's a lot of discussion to think how we can maximize that context. So in terms of how to prepare the teachers, different countries and different regions and different institutions have been suggesting different approaches to support the teachers in terms of the skills that they might require. For instance, we have the digital competence for educators in the EU, in which they have defined a whole framework and different stages of progression. In UNESCO, for instance, they have a similar framework, but unpacked in different areas where they might be applying their skills, but also the institutions might have also capacities that are important to take into account. Whatever the framework you take, it's going to be very important to think that teachers will require much more than technical tools. So the instrumental skills are really important because they enable us to talk about this language and to use these tools like for today to talk between us. But at the same time, it's a pedagogical component is not well addressed, meaning how we can balance between what has to be synchronous, what can be asynchronous, what is the level of frequency, how do we adjust from the in-person to the remote, when do we activate rebates? We might not have the whole picture. Likewise, I think there's another and deeper change which has to do with changing in the mindset, which might be understood as having more than one teacher in the classroom, or teaching more than one subject at the same time, or redesigning the tools and the instruments to assess learning. So during the pandemic, we have seen a whole breadth of options, in some cases, much more unidirectional, and in others, much more multi-directional. And in each one of these actions, the supporting system will be different. And the strategies that we have seen in many countries during the last couple of months has been highly multi-channel. And multi-channel is good because that is more inclusive for those who might not have all the infrastructure. But at the same time, we learn differently through different technologies. So having a diversity of technology is going to be very important. But here I have to make a quick stop on something that I think is important. These technologies, whatever they are very helpful to transfer information from point A to point B. But we know that we don't learn simply having access to information. When we know something, in order to understand it, we have to connect it with our experience. We have to connect it with the previous knowledge we have. And if we really want to inherit that knowledge, we have to transition to an additional stage, which is practicing it. We have to use it. We have to put it into action. We have to experiment it. We have to make mistakes. All these elements are important. So if the focus is only on delivering of the information, we might not have the full process. So when we are teaching, it's really important to take into account that. And neuroscience said to us that it's important to address complex ideas that will help us to connect with the previous experience and the previous knowledge we have. With addressing problems like the global warming or the pandemic are very good social complex problems that we can consider. But we are not robots. We are not only knowing because we collect data. We have emotions, and emotions play such an important role during the learning experience. And emotions are highly contagious, and emotions can imply that we might learn or address problems in a different way. So here the challenge we have is how can we find a balance between facilitating and learning and remote learning in this case with some level of emotion, but without having it extremely to pushing the students to a level that may get stressed. So it's important to have some kind of moderate level of emotion in order to activate the base of the learning without having burnout. Now here, the question I have is, how do we facilitate those emotions in remote environments, which sometimes might require a different strategy? I think many of you might know this model 70-20-10, which suggests that 70% of what we learn is by doing, 20% is by learning with others, and 10% by learning from the contents. Don't put a lot of attention into the numbers because I think it's just a trend. But I think the question we have is, how can we facilitate this highly theoretical, this highly social, and this highly practical learning during the pandemic? I think it's something that is a question that remains to be addressed and solved. I think there are two questions to approach this. One is, how can we design effective support? And you can change the question, how can we design effective support? Because here the important element is not only to be sure that we have the appropriate technology, but we design the conditions for learners to receive the support when they need it. And that has to do with some experts mentioned Maslow before Bloom. Maslow before Bloom will mean not only focusing on the cognitive task, but also having a look at the well-being of the learner. And here, parents and the caregivers will play such an important role in order to facilitate these conditions. And the second question has to do with who should participate in the supportive home system. And I think, as I said, the parents can play an important role, but that will diversify the coordinations. Parents with teachers, teachers with students, and students with parents. So there's a virtuous circle of potential benefits that needs to be addressed. But at the same time, a supportive home system will require to adjust its contents to facilitate the teaching remotely, where learners might not have all the same kind of technology, the same kind of infrastructure, and in some cases, the same kind of digital skills. So all these conditions need to be addressed. So let me briefly mention what are the potential scenarios that we observe today. We have school systems and teachers who provide strong support, while in other cases, the school system provides limited support. And in other cases, we have parents who provide strong involvement during the learning process. In other cases, parental provide only a low involvement. So let's think in the ideal scenario, and let's use Mariam as an approach. So when Mariam have a strong support from both sides, parents will receive regular support, the communication about her progress will be constant with the appropriate information, and parents will receive the guidance and they will allocate the time they require to support Mariam. Now, if the school support is limited, parents will be flying on their own. They will know exactly what is the stage of the progress, and although they have the willingness to support, they might have little information to know how to support her daughter. Now, in the other corner, we have strong support from the system and low parental support. So here is very delicate because the schools and the teachers might provide all the communication of the progress, but at the same time, the parents might not be responsible of this information. So Mariam will be on her own. And the final, and the red light has to do with environments which I think are happening in many places of the world, where there's limited support from the system, the parents don't have the time or the willingness to support, so she will feel unsupported, and it's very easy that she might get disengaged. So these are the potential scenarios that we have to navigate. And in many cases, throughout the learning experience, people are moving from these different environments. So when we design a support system, we have to take into account so many dimensions, like the dashboard control, whether the learning is going to be happening at individual level or a collective level, where the learning has to be, the learning process has to be fully synchronous, asynchronous, or a combination. The learning has to be self-driven or prescriptive. The learning has to be simply disciplinary or interdisciplinary. The learner has to be driven only by intrinsic or extrinsic motivations. The learner will emphasize the cognitive or the affective. And I think teachers will play such an important role here. So when we design these systems, we have to secure access to connectivity to devices and platforms, but also the appropriate access to training to teachers, to remote tutoring, but at the same time, some support from the emotional point of view, as we mentioned, and also guidance to parents. So all these dimensions will have to be considered in the dash panel. Can we measure these elements? And I think this is an important question and somehow difficult. Can we measure? And if we could measure it, what is the best way of measuring? So here's the challenge we have. We have so many dimensions, and the technologies will allow us to have so much data. But here we have to be careful. We don't have to measure only the things that are easy to measure. We have to measure the things that we think are important. So sometimes engagement or frustration or excitement might be more difficult to track, but at the same time, those will be very important drivers. So having a closer look at what are the tools that we have when we measure these approaches is going to be critical. So my colleagues from the EdTech Hub, this British entity, have designed a very interesting framework to consider the blended learning environment. We have to take into account, for instance, the infrastructure, the blending of the teaching and the learning materials, the support that teacher will provide, the institutional practice, how can we improve the quality of the learning, build a robust system of networks to support teachers, and as well as parental and caregivers engagement. So this is a 360 degrees approach for all the dimensions that we have to take into account. I know it might be overwhelming or daunting at the beginning, but it's important to have the big picture. Otherwise, if the focus is simply on the delivery of the contents or in the containers, we might be forgetting the context. So having said that, and before finishing, I think that it's important to understand what is going to be the outcome of these remote learning experiences. But that outcome won't be fully understood if we don't understand what is the quality of the practice that the teachers and the students and the parents are having. And at the same time, understand to what extent the policies are driving towards those practices. And if possible, understand at the same time whether the bureaucratic capacity and the politic infrastructure will be an enabler of all these conditions. So I think there is a multi-stage, and we will have to have an interesting partnership between experts and between organizations to provide information about all these elements. So at the bank, we are building instruments to track and monitor what is the implementation of the policy and to what extent this policy is happening at the school level. And now with an important layer of the parents, and to see to what extent parents can facilitate many of these dimensions. Let me finish with this slide, so we will be on time. The World Bank suggests that when we think in these remote supportive systems, we have to address 5 principles. The first one is ask why, having a very clear purpose of the goal that we want to reach. These technologies are extremely multi-purpose, but if we don't have a very clear, and very narrow and focalized priority, it's very easy to get lost in the middle, and at the same time, it's going to be very hard to track and monitor the success. Number 2, we have to design solutions that are scalable, that will benefit the most of the students. If we have very boutique, very specific solutions, we might be excluding many. The third principle has to do with the empowering teachers. These technologies should not be considered as tools to bypass teachers, but to give teachers higher command and higher control and facilitating, putting these technologies at the service of the educators. Number 4, engaging the ecosystem. Ministry of Education will have to work in close partnership with the telecom agencies, with the EdTech startup context, and also with the publisher sector. So there has to be built an engaging ecosystem which will facilitate the Ministry of Organization to orchestrate all these players. And finally, this idea that using good data, we will be able to take good decisions, meaning that if we use this information, even in difficult times like the current one, we will be allowing the Ministry of Education to become learning organizations, which I think is going to be one of the central roles. So I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kobo, for keeping on time. This was very insightful, and I'm guessing what kind of emotions went through the brains of our students during the past year and how that has affected their learning experience. But I will leave the comments and the questions for the end. And now it is my pleasure to present our last speaker of this first session, Dr. Krista Rockings, a policy analyst in the Directorate for Education and Skills at OECD. Dr. Krista's extensive experience includes teaching and school leadership, working as an education consultant, advising social enterprises, non-governmental organizations, and private companies on topics relating to teacher training and management, skills development, and conducting comparative research into education policy across the school systems. Currently, Dr. Krista works on the Educational Policy Outlook, the OECD's Analytical Observatory of Education Policy, which has over 40 participating education systems. Today, Dr. Krista will be speaking about systems to support parents, caregivers, and families in general with children's remote learning. Again, if you have any questions for Dr. Krista, please write them in the chat box. Just after her presentation, we will have a general Q&A session. Dr. Krista, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Patricia. I hope everyone can hear me and can see my presentation.
Yes, very well.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you to the organisers for bringing us together today to discuss what is a very important topic. I am a policy analyst with the Education Policy Outlook at the OECD, and today I'll be sharing some insights from our work at the Outlook as the OECD's Analytical Observatory of Education Policy, as well as evidence from wider OECD education work on the role that parents play in supporting remote learning. And you'll note that on my slides, the word remote is in brackets, because while parents' role may have changed during the pandemic and responsibilities shifted as schools closed and learning took place in the home, parents have a key role to play in children's learning, whatever the delivery mode. And I'd actually like to emphasize 2 of the things Cristobal said in his presentation just before mine that I think are really important for us to remember throughout my presentation. The first is that learning is a relational process, not transactional, and therefore parents are at the heart of those relationships that take place for learning. Also, post-pandemic, we need to be thinking less in binary terms, either in-person or distance learning, school-based or home-based learning. Rather, we're more likely to be operating across a spectrum of delivery modes for education, and parents have a role to play all the way along that spectrum. But more of that later. In my presentation, I'll be exploring the key question: how can parents and carers be better supported to nurture children's learning? And through that, I'll be looking at three questions in particular. Why does it matter? How has the situation evolved during the pandemic? And so what, after this, so what should be the priorities for the recovery and beyond? Just to say that I will be using the word parents for brevity, but I should clarify that this refers to anyone in a caring role in the home and actually extends beyond parents to the family unit or home unit in general. So starting with the first question, why do parental involvement and support matter? Well, the OECD has a range of data highlighting the importance of parents in supporting students' learning, both emotionally and academically, home-based and school-based, and for those in the very earliest years of childhood education, as well as older students in formal schooling. So we can see here, for example, that very importantly, parental support does have an impact on student learning outcomes. And actually that impact is particularly important for the most disadvantaged students. So this figure shows the relationship between parental support and academic resilience. This is a term used in PISA to describe students from the lowest socioeconomic quartile, that's the most disadvantaged students, who still perform amongst the highest performing students in reading. And as you can see from this figure, in many countries, in fact, in most countries, those who report receiving the most support from their parents are more likely to be high performers in reading. So for example, right at the left of the screen, you can see that in Kosovo, there are almost 20% more resilient learners among those students who have a high index of parental support than there are among those who have a low index of parental support. And in the region, we can see that in Jordan, it's around 14%, and in Saudi Arabia, it's around 10%. At the same time, students reporting higher parental support also demonstrate the kinds of learning attitudes that are positively associated with higher outcomes. And this effect holds, as you can see from the figure, even after we've accounted for student and schools' socioeconomic profile and also for their performance in reading. So it's the same for low performers as it is for high performers. This means that as the PISA index of parental support increases, so too does, for example, students' confidence in their own ability, as well as their positive feelings towards life. And actually, in particular, we can see that there is a substantial effect on learning attitudes that we would associate with high learning outcomes, such as the motivation and goal setting aspects. And interestingly, I think these are the kinds of attitudes that become particularly important once children are learning remotely and are forced to become more autonomous and independent in their learning. We can also see that different parenting styles have an influence on children's outcomes. So colleagues at the OECD's 21st Century Children Project conducted a meta-analysis of research into parenting styles. And as you can see from the first row, they identified numerous studies, each of which is represented by a circle in this table, in which the positive relationship between an authoritative parenting style and academic success was demonstrated. as well as for emotional development and also social development. In contrast, we can see that other parenting styles are negatively influencing different outcomes for students. And that is particularly true for an authoritarian parenting style and for neglectful parenting. But when we break this down, what does this actually mean for parents? What can parents do to support their children to have better outcomes? Well, PISA looks at parental emotional support, which is an index that covers things like parental support for education, for difficulties that students face, and also for developing confidence. So we can see, going back to what Cristobal was saying about Maslow before Bloom, here we can really see that creating those feelings of safety and confidence among children really become crucial before they can even start thinking about developing their learning and their educational outcomes. PISA also looks into parental involvement in school, and this would relate to discussions around children's progress with teachers, but also participation in school government and participation in extracurricular activities or volunteering. And then in terms of an authoritative parenting style, this has been identified as parents who are both demanding and responsive. So they set clear, reasonable rules that are in line with children's abilities. They enforce them firmly, but they're also happy to explain these rules to students and discuss their expectations. At the same time, they are warm, loving, and responsive to their children's needs. I just want to highlight one quick warning here that not every aspect of these is clearly associated with positive learning outcomes. And in fact, interestingly, the impact of parental participation in school government and extracurricular activities is less clear when it comes to educational outcomes. And actually, in terms of the former, participation in local school government may have a negative effect on children's outcomes, although of course there's a range of possible explanations for this. So moving to the second question, now that we've shown that parental involvement and support does have an influence on educational outcomes, we need to consider how parental involvement and support evolved during the pandemic. So pre-pandemic, OECD data indicated that parental involvement in early childhood education was high. However, at school level, PISA 2018 data shows room for improvement. In some countries, we can see to the left of this figure that children felt very well supported by their parents. For instance, in Iceland, in Portugal, in New Zealand, we can see that children are reporting an index of parents' emotional support of over 0.2. At the other end of the scale, however, and actually there are more countries where children reported a negative index of emotional support, we can see that for some countries like Morocco, Poland and Macau, that this reaches below -0.3 in some cases. We can also see that there's room for improvement in terms of parental involvement in school activities. So, for example, less than 50% of parents discussed their child's progress with a teacher on their own initiative in the 12 months prior to the PISA test, the PISA survey in 2018. Even fewer parents were involved in school government and volunteering activities. And although it's closer to 60% when we're talking about teachers initiating conversations with parents about child's progress, let's not forget that that's still fewer than 2/3 of parents being involved in these kinds of conversations during an academic year. PISA also gives us information about what parents feel are the barriers to their involvement. And although reports of barriers are generally low, we can see many of these are below 10%, for example. We can see also that in some countries, when we look at the OECD, the PISA, maximum, as demonstrated by the red outline, in some of these countries, the barriers really are very, very high. And in particular, that's true when it comes to aspects related to time. Parents reported not being involved in school activities because the meeting times were inconvenient or they were not able to get off work. And actually, a way forward for schools and governments will be to think about how to take advantage of digital tools here. And in that sense, the pandemic is likely to have kick-started some positive efforts in that regard. So interestingly, in the first months of the pandemic, a very high share of governments responding to an OECD Harvard survey of education continuity strategies reported that parents and carers were indeed a key priority when it came to education continuity, as were other supports for home life, such as supporting parents with whose language was not the same as the language of instruction, or supporting students who are at risk of violence in the home. Later in the pandemic, in March 2021, governments responding to an OECD, World Bank, UNICEF, UNESCO survey provided further detail on how they were promoting interaction with parents. And modes of the communication, typical modes of communication, such as phone calls and emails, were the most frequent types of interaction. But we did start to see a smaller number of countries who were promoting deeper forms of engagement through involving parents in planning, teaching and learning activities, and also who were surveying parents to get feedback on remote learning. And we had around 10 countries for each of those. We can look to some specific policy examples to shine further light on some of the approaches to facilitating parental support during the pandemic. For example, addressing that barrier of time and flexibility of time for parents, we can see that Sweden introduced greater flexibility in existing legislation around employment leave, enabling parents to use 96 days of their paid leave for older children. At the same time, Chile and Austria were facilitating interactions between parents and teachers through promoting and developing tools for student-centered conferences between teachers, parents, and students, and also through training teachers on how to communicate with parents. And in Israel, a dedicated online portal for parents was developed through which they could access learning tasks to be used in the home. At the same time, there were some efforts to encourage those deeper forms of collaboration we've been talking about. The Latvian example is a very interesting one. Like many countries, Latvia developed daily educational programs to broadcast via national television and also online. The unique thing about the Latvian example is that the material was developed by teachers with the support of a voluntary parents group who were there to provide feedback on the feasibility of these activities in the home. At the same time, Latvia was also collecting lots of information about parental feedback on educational continuity to support further governmental efforts. Finland held a national online parents' idea of maintaining that communication between parents and teachers and students. And in Brazil, in the state of Maranhão, the Secretary of State for Education collaborated with an NGO to develop a program of supports for parents of children in early education. in particular targeting those from low-income backgrounds. We know that parents were a key stakeholder for many countries in the school reopening process. And interestingly, in responses to an OECD survey, they were seen as much a priority stakeholder in that process as principals of schools themselves. The Education Policy Outlook has conducted further analysis of reopening plans and identified developing partnerships beyond the education institution, which includes parents, as one of 4 key shared priorities across the 40 education systems considered. And further analysis sheds light on the specific actions being implemented. So while many education systems stress the importance of maintaining clear and regular communication with parents, some were providing very specific ideas for how to do that, such as communication strategies for schools, templates for communication publications, and also recommended digital tools. Very few were promoting deeper collaboration, but those that were involving parents of younger learners in planning teaching content and holding regular conversations with parents about student progress, or informing parents and consulting with parents for decision making. Again, there were a couple of really interesting examples. Colombia's Family School Alliance is the most comprehensive. Although it was already planned pre-pandemic, it was adapted in light of the pandemic experience. And it is based on the idea of co-responsibility in education and care. Japan has also been recruiting extra staff into schools, and one of their key roles will be supporting school staff with parental communication. So, what does this mean for our priorities moving forward? The Education Policy Outlook released a handbook at the end of 2020 for policymakers to support them with the recovery period. And we identified 3 key lessons. The first lesson draws on the fact that COVID-19 has changed the way we need to think about education, and that countries need to embrace the opportunity to move beyond this binary model of education, online or offline, towards an approach which covers a spectrum. And that within this, people and processes are going to be much more important than physical spaces and instruments. Lessons 2 and 3 go deeper into that lesson. 2 looks at how teachers can be better supported, and 3 explores the urgent task of addressing learning gaps exacerbated by the crisis. In particular, this requires collaboration with parents, and policy analysis from the pre-pandemic period indicates that the most effective intervention for learning initiatives are based on strong homeschool links. Taking this work a step further, the Education Policy Outlook has been developing a framework for responsiveness and resilience in education policy, which will be launched in November of this year. And here, the role of parents is central in building resilience at learner level and in supporting the resilience of learning environments. We define a resilient broader learning environment as one which transcends the education institution to shape a dynamic and collaborative local education network. And this requires positioning the institution at the heart of a strategic web of actors. So efforts to do this require convening a wider range of actors, parents included, to advance the work of institutions, and in particular, nurturing holistic, longer term and deeper collaboration partnerships with them. So bringing all this together, it's critical to remember that learning in the pandemic and post-pandemic period does not happen in individual distinct spaces. Rather, it's constantly moving between the institution, the home, the community, and digital online spaces. Parents play a crucial role as a partner that transcends the home, moving between all those spaces as well and supporting the learner in each of those environments. With that in mind, policymakers have 4 priorities. Help parents understand their role in 21st century students. Communicate and clarify for parents the evidence around what works best. Nurture holistic, longer-term, deeper collaborations, and support educators to drive these relationships further. That concludes the presentation. Sorry if I've gone over a couple of seconds. I look forward to your questions later.
Thank you so much. Dr. Krista, it's really remarkable how your presentation actually ends up to be so well connected with the previous one from Dr. Kobo. At the end, as you said, education has a lot to do with, more interaction than transference. So it's more relational than anything else. And it's all reflected on both your presentations. Thank you so much for presenting here today at the seminar. His Excellency Dr. Hamad had to leave, so he apologizes for not being here to participate in the Q&A session. So I'm going to move forward with a couple of questions, and I will just, present them to you and let you choose which one of you or both of you would like to comment on some of the comments and the questions that are here from the other participants. And there is a comment over here that I think it's for Dr. Kobo that is related to the use of technology and the success that educational systems may have using these technological devices. Well, the comment is, the success is related to the availability of these technological devices and equipments and high-speed internet connection. And those conditions are not met in many countries around the world. So, having such a powerful tool or set of tools, and then, some basic infrastructure conditions are not met in so many countries, and that has left many students without access to technology. So this is a comment. You might also want to comment on this. I'm going to just, share two other questions or comments, and then I will open the floor for your comments. So the first one was related to the technology and the fact that many people around the world have not a technological infrastructure that would help support the use of technology. There is another question here that says that according to UNICEF, millions of children did not have access to school during the pandemic. According to UNESCO, prioritizing education recovery is crucial to avoid a generational catastrophe. In your opinion, how can we recover from the learning losses from the past year? So this is another question. So how can we recover from the fact that so many children did not have access to school? And finally, I'm going to leave a third question on the table, and then you can pick up any of these or all of them and comment. And it says, does this digital transformation in the educational process requires qualitative standards for preparing teachers? So if we are shifting towards a more digital school, how can we prepare teachers, and what qualitative standards should we have for preparing the teachers if this shift either to a blended learning model or to a distance learning model becomes the new way of going to school in the near future? And I will close my mouth now and let you both comment on these very interesting questions that were shared by our audience. Dr. Cristobal?
Okay, first of all, thank you very much. I was wondering whether Krista wanted to say something, or should I start? Whatever you prefer.
Krista, would you like to start?
Please go ahead, Cristobal.
Okay. Ladies first, but I'm happy to start and follow up. Well, thank you for two things. One is for putting us together, because I think the two presentations talk to each other in a very nice way. And thank you also for the questions. These are relevant questions, are questions with a global perspective, and I think that they do address some of the most challenging problems that we have to overcome these days, but also for the years to come. Let's start with the technology. The situation in the world before the pandemic was that half of the world didn't have access to internet. 3.5 billion human beings lack access to infrastructure. But even in those environments where there is access to infrastructure, in many of the cases, there's only one single mobile device per household. So how much can we expect of the technology if there's such a strong limitations of access? So I think the question is very important to frame the complexity of the situation. During the pandemic, what we have observed is countries have been addressing the idea of a multi-channel strategy, combining low and high-tech solutions, all the way from radio and television, printed materials, to mobile features phones, smartphones, and more advanced video systems in which they require more connectivity and more data. Which is the best technology? I would say the combination of them. We have a comprehensive pedagogical strategy. And in many advanced countries, the radio and television is still being used. So I don't think we have to put in a ranking the good and the bad technologies. I think the value will be obviously when we have opportunities of having a dialogue and interaction. It doesn't have to be with video. It doesn't have to be all the time. It can be asynchronous, but some level of interaction and follow-up will play an important role. Now, the interesting thing is, even in environments where the connectivity is available, the learning is not happening as it was expected. So we have to understand that the constraint is not only the infrastructure, which is definitely one, and my first slide was this, enabling conditions, but at the same time, we have to take into account that if we don't generate a number of additional conditions to support that technology, we might be offering a very poor learning experience with high technology. And I think my colleague Justin Wright wrote an amazing book about that, and you will hear about him in a minute. The second aspect has to do with the actions that the school will need to address for trying to overcome the complexities of the learning loss that we have observed in the last couple of months. And what are the actions that need to be adopted for the recovery? And I think different countries are implementing different strategies. It's too early to know which is the successful one. Probably successful will be a comprehensive set of approaches, like extending the learning time, like prioritizing some subjects, like adding other collaborators in the learning experience, like additional coaches or tutors. Countries are subsidizing coaches and tutors to facilitate the learning. And in other environments, is simply a near peer support. So I think we have to consider a diverse approach, a toolkit of solutions, understanding that there will be learners who will be left behind, and additional actions to support those, not for the next 6 months, but in a much more consistent way, will be important. So countries, for instance, are recruiting the number of teachers. That can be in action. Other countries are bringing back those teachers who were retired, so they are bringing their experience. I think we have to be very creative to find solutions that will be benefiting those learners who might be left behind in different ways. In some cases, just a living access to contents, and in other cases, to have, when possible, this human interaction. I will stop here in order to hear Christy, whether she has to add something.
Thank you, Cristobal. Dr. Krista?
Thank you. I ought to just clarify before we go any further that I'm not a doctor, so I don't want anyone to think that it's just Krista.
My apologies.
No problem at all. It's just better to clarify. I'll pick up on what Cristobal was saying in terms of recovering the learning loss, which really is the priority for many education systems moving forward. I think there are two key things here, as well as echoing everything that Cristobal said. The first thing is that in order to address the learning gaps, we need to assess them first. We need to diagnose where the gaps are. And one of the biggest problems facing us, or facing many education systems, is that during the pandemic, standardized assessments were often reduced, cancelled, postponed, delayed, and so on. And so we don't always have quality information about where the gaps are. So that's a priority. The second thing is, on that knowledge, then implementing additional remedial initiatives. And as Cristobal said, this is going to take some creativity. But at the same time, I would like to urge us as well to ensure that that creativity is informed by past experiences. We do have a wealth of past experience of trying to address learning gaps, and there is good evidence of what can work, and that's what we should be building initiatives or interventions on moving forward. In particular, that means addressing student well-being as well as addressing learning. And that goes back to what both of us were saying about the parents' role in ensuring the right environment and the right mindset for students as they move forward with their learning. We also know that a key feature of addressing learning gaps, a positive feature of addressing learning gaps, is the home-school relationship. So ensuring that parents are on board with whatever intervention plans are in place for their children. Capacity building for teachers and educators is a big thing as well, and we will need targeted and more specific capacity building to address the learning gaps. And then finally, evaluation and assessment. Formative assessment to drive learning recovery, but also monitoring at a system level to, once those gaps have been diagnosed, to then consider how those gaps are successfully being addressed. And so that then, I suppose, this question of capacity building for educators goes back to the audience question about preparing teachers for a future of education where blended learning plays a larger role, and the role of potentially teacher standards in supporting that. Certainly we've seen over the last decade or more the importance of teaching standards in driving improvement for teaching in many education systems. And we can see that they'll be important going forward, and that as digital learning becomes more important, those standards will need to be updated or take that into account. What I would stress again, though, is and I'm in danger of sounding like a broken record, but as we said before, both of us, learning is relational and not transactional. And so many of the things that make learning high quality in the classroom make learning high quality online. And so a lot of the standards that are already in place and the way teachers are being trained and the competencies that teachers are developing remain important when they are working within a system that favours blended learning or distance learning and so on. So we certainly shouldn't be thinking that we need to reinvent the wheel at this point.
Thank you so much, Krista, and thank you so much to Dr. Kobo for your presentations here today. This was really an excellent session, and I think we have addressed, spoken about some of the concerns and some of the scenarios that are going around the world in the education field due to the pandemic for the past year or even more than now. Thank you so much for attending the session today. We are exactly on time. I would like, on my behalf, to thank the organization, the Regional Center for Educational Planning, and Dr. Mahra for their kind invitation to moderate this session. And I will hand over now to you, Dr. Macher.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for sharing your experience with us. It was excellent session. We learned a lot, and we didn't lose any participant. They are all here, and I think that means that they are enjoying the information and they are learning, and this is what we want. Now we will start the second session. Our moderator, Dr. Jenny, are you here?
Yes, sorry. Yeah, hi, how are you?
Hi, Dr.
How are you,
Jenny?
Dr. Maher?
Good, how are you? I
Good.
think I will leave the floor for you so you can start your session, and let's complete this journey.
Okay, thank you. So first I'd like to thank everybody for the last session. I think that what we're going to be talking about now is very relevant and will build on what we've already talked about in the previous session. So again, good afternoon. Thanks for joining us in the session 2 today. My name is Dr. Jenny Eppert, and I am an assistant professor at Zayed University with a specialization in educational technology and assistive technology. So whereas some of our themes before were more in line with the parents and government, the second session seems to be focusing more on teachers and community, although we will be revisiting some of the same topics that we discussed before and how they are related to the ones coming up. So I will introduce each speaker separately, and they will each be given 20 minutes to speak. And then I will notify them at the 5-minute mark, the 2-minute mark, and the 1 minute when they have how many more minutes they have remaining. So again, please send questions through the chat, and we will revisit these questions, or as many as we can, at the end during the question and answer session. So let me go ahead and introduce the first presenter. It's Dr. Justin Wright, who is an assistant professor of digital media in the Comparative Media Studies Writing Department at MIT. His writings have been published in many journals, conference proceedings, as well as he has written several books and also articles in newspapers. So he is going to talk about the importance of the role of the teacher in our COVID and post-COVID educational systems. So go ahead, Dr. Wright, please.
Thanks so much for having me. Can you all hear me and see my screen?
Yes.
Great. Terrific. So my lab, well, first of all, it's really wonderful to be here, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity. It's also bright and early here on the East Coast of the United States. So if I am a little delirious, you'll have to forgive me. But I'm really glad I got a chance to be a part of this seminar. I run a lab at MIT called the Teaching Systems Lab. We aspire to design, implement, and research the future of teacher learning. There are 3 publications that we put out pretty close to the beginning of the pandemic, about a year ago, about remote learning guidance from US state agencies, about a series of design exercises that we did with multi-stakeholder groups, and then interviews with about 40 teachers from across the United States. And I'll talk from some of those experiences, and then also just from the opportunity to talk with educators all around the world about the challenges that they've been facing this year. So let me start with this. What do we know about K-12 virtual schooling and learning before the pandemic? What did things look like before the world turned upside down? And I think one of the most important features to understand about virtual schools is that they're really coached homeschooling. The schools for virtual learning that existed before the pandemic, they assume the presence of a parent or caregiver, and they're primarily organized around asynchronous learning. They assume that families spend between 2 and 5 hours a day doing learning time, and really good virtual school teachers in these existing settings, they don't spend all day on Zoom with their students. They spend most of their time putting together a curriculum, sending it to families. In one survey, they report spending about 6 hours per week in synchronous instruction. And then really most of the rest of their time is spent individually reaching out and connecting with students who need the most help. There's no expectation in the existing virtual schools, for instance, that a K-12 virtual teacher should be able to maintain the attention of a 7-year-old for 4 or 5 or 6 hours a day through some kind of online connection. The assumption is that really the home is the center place of learning. There's also increasing evidence that these online environments, on average, do not serve students as well as what would be their face-to-face equivalent. Susan Dynarski at the University of Michigan wrote a New York Times article summarizing her view of the research, which says online courses harm the students who need the most help. There was a community college researcher in the United States who studied Latino students in California who described what he called the online penalty, which is that for most students, when you move them from a face-to-face classroom environment to an online classroom environment, their performance goes down. And that penalty, that worse performance, it typically is more serious for our most vulnerable, least well-served students. So students with lower prior GPA, students in racial minorities, students who are in some other vulnerable or protected class. There's a lot of reason to believe that many students struggle with online schooling. What's sort of ironic about that is that actually almost everyone in the networked world is really good at online learning. When people study things online, even young adults, adolescents, when they study things that they care about and they're interested in, they're really good at learning. And you know that because you've seen kids who've learned TikTok dances or learned how to do some coding that they're interested in, or beat a level in a video game, or do their hair or makeup in new ways. When we pursue the things that we're interested in online, people are remarkably proficient, motivated, successful learners. When we try to get them to learn the things that schools teach, where they have much lower intrinsic motivation, online schooling is usually really hard. So what was supposed to happen in online schools or in schools that transition to, as Cristobal described, some combination of radio, television, hybrid learning, limited use of buildings? There were sort of two big debates about that. One set of ideas was that schools during the pandemic were supposed to make forward progress on standards-aligned curriculum. Basically, do the kinds of things that you were doing before, but teach a little less, or be a little bit more focused about what you want to have students learn this year. A second approach said that actually there's very little reason to believe that schools should be able to operate remotely in people's homes. That trying to do school at a distance in people's homes is kind of a recipe for disaster. Instead, what we ought to think about is what's the kind of good learning that can happen in a home? To what extent should we try to replicate the school day as it exists? And so to what extent should we work with parents and families and educators to say, what kind of learning environments are available in our houses, in our surrounding communities, in places that we can go safely? And what kind of learning should we have happen there? I was interviewed by a reporter from the Arctic Sounder, from a place in Alaska, very, very remote, where villages are connected by float plane. And she interviewed other teachers as well, who said, look, we can mail printed packets home to families, but there's not going to be a whole lot of learning that happens through that. We're not going to build internet connection in the next few months or the next year between these remote villages. But this is a great time to learn Inupiaq values. This is a great time to learn how to hunt, how to cook, how to bead, how to fix a snow machine. And that, I think, was some of the debate that was happening. A second debate that was happening was, to what extent, as we recreate schools, should we try to use the model that's widely used in existing virtual schools of kind of asynchronous coached homeschooling? And to what extent should we replicate synchronous schooling? To what extent should we have like a series of 47 or 52-minute classes that one follows up after the other? I would say overwhelmingly in the United States, particularly by the time we restarted school this year, there was a strong emphasis on getting remote schooling to look as much as possible like regular schooling, to have there be synchronous learning experiences facilitated on Zoom or some other teleconferencing system, and then to have, school basically kind of address the same curriculum aligned topics that it had in the past. One of the things that struck me, particularly early on in the pandemic, was this question, what do we want for our students when our society felt most vulnerable? I was struck looking at a bunch of these. This is a daily schedule from San Antonio Independent School District from March or April of 2020. And it's a daily schedule for the kind of most emergency remote Zoom schooling. And one of the things that struck me about this daily schedule and many others is that almost all of them had a shortened school day. They said, we're not going to try to do a full 6 hours of school at the beginning of the pandemic. Let's just try to get 3 hours done. But in that 3 hours, there was almost always time reserved for physical fitness and for creative expression, for fine arts. In our schools in the United States, in normal times, we don't make time every day for physical exercise and creative expression in schools. But when we felt like our society was most vulnerable, we said to ourselves, we really ought to make more time for arts and physical education in school. When our society was most vulnerable, what did we want for our young people? And why don't we always want those things for our students is a question that I've been thinking about a lot. So we did an interview-based study last year with 40 teachers sort of around this time in 2020. We're replicating that study again now. We've got about 50 teachers we've interviewed. We have about 200 teachers who've interviewed their students and sent some feedback back to us. And one question that we're trying to ask is, what is actually happening in schools? And the answer to that question is actually quite difficult to come up with. One reason is that everyone is having a different pandemic. There are some schools in places that were hit quite hard that remain, mostly in some shutdown form as of today. There are schools, in rural areas reasonably shielded from the coronavirus, where school barely, kids put on masks and schools went the way they were. There are some students, a pretty small proportion, that have really thrived during remote learning, that have found that the independence has really benefited them. For most students, though, any kind of pivot to distance learning has been somewhere between a disappointment and a disaster. There's been a lot of evidence on sort of quantitative research trying to capture something about what happened to test scores, if there were any tests, or what happened to people's performance in online, adaptive math tutoring and things like that. We actually have very little sort of observational research about what's happening in schools, and so we don't know much. For districts with constrained schedules, Are all the classes being shortened easily, or are we doing what we've done in other kinds of times of curriculum focus, of cutting things like social studies, science, and the arts to support so-called, core subjects? There's no way in a year in the United States where nearly 500,000 people have died, we think maybe 40,000 students have lost a parent or grandparent. There's no way that teachers can cover the same curriculum in a typical year. So what modifications are being made? In science classes, how are lab-based classes operating? In project-based classes, how are those classes operating? For the most part, we actually don't know the answers to these questions very well. And I think it's quite urgent for systems to not only ask the question, what kinds of outcomes are we seeing on standardized assessments or things like that, but actually just the more basic question of what happened? What was going on in those classrooms? I think the best guess in the United States and in many other countries in the developed world is that schools chose an emphasis of standards aligned progress over some kind of home learning. There are a very small handful of districts that made some kind of modest structural change. The main one in the United States seems to be there's some high schools that shifted to 3 classes a semester instead of 6 a year, but very, very few structural changes. And very, very little guidance from the state, very, very little guidance from districts about what kinds of changes teachers should make in the curriculum to accommodate such a strange year. But of course, there has to have been extensive teacher modification of what's happening because it's not possible to do a typical school year under these conditions. My read of the technology situation in places in which there's been remote learning is that overwhelmingly there have been 2 dominant technologies of the pandemic, and they are 2 of our very oldest technologies. So I think there's very little adoption of open online courses, sort of minimal, limited use of adaptive tutors. There was virtually no use of augmented reality or virtual reality, all these sort of cutting edge technologies that people talk about as potentially being transformative. Instead, for the most part, what schools used were learning management systems and video telephony. So learning management systems, things like Schoology, Google Classroom, Canvas, these are basically tools that allow teachers and students to pass documents back and forth. My daughter has a folder in her backpack. She's an elementary school student. One side says to home and one side says to school. And that's basically what learning management systems do. And then the second main technology is the one that we're using now. And when it was introduced in the 1930s, it was called video telephony. And it sort of lets us talk with one another, like nominally, I can see some of you and you can see me, and maybe we can hear each other's voices. But for anyone who's taught on Zoom this year, you know that teaching through Zoom is kind of like teaching through a keyhole. You can kind of see and hear what's happening on the other side, but it's not really conducive to meaningful interaction. So this leads to kind of one of the extraordinary paradoxes of pandemic teaching, which is on the one hand, teachers put in extraordinary efforts to completely transform our educational systems overnight. I was reading online one teacher saying, I'd spent the last 5 years sort of begging and scraping together enough funds to have 1 cart of Chromebooks for my classroom. And then the pandemic hit and all of a sudden the district found money for truckloads of them. Enormous efforts by educators to transform our educational system. But ironically, they transformed it into something that looks almost exactly like the thing that we had before, sort of transformed it into a kind of a kabuki theater version of in-person classroom teaching offered over Zoom. We will not see a more powerful demonstration of the conservatism of education systems in our lifetime. So these 2 technologies, I think we will find as we do more research, were really at the core of people's transition to some form of hybrid learning. And then they were supplemented in schools by a few things. In the United States, in March and April and May of 2020, a middle school student might have 6 or 7 teachers. Each of those 6 or 7 teachers sent student home with 2 or 3 different apps that they wanted to use in their class. And that totally overwhelmed students and families. And folks said, forget that. Schools then decided they needed to become more collaborative and choose a much smaller set of resources to use. And so my sense is, and there's not really good research to bear this out, but that most schools kind of chose one math app, one reading app, 1 or 2 kind of supplementary content apps, added that to the learning management system and video conferencing, and that's kind of what students used. As Cristobal very kindly noted, I have a new book out called Failure to Disrupt: Why Technology Alone Can't Transform Education. And for 2 decades, education technology enthusiasts have said that we're on this cusp of a revolution in educational systems. But I think the best way to understand what teachers have done is that they've overwhelmingly adopted our oldest technologies to replicate as closely as possible traditional classroom practices. It's been an extraordinarily difficult time for teachers. There have been huge challenges for most students in maintaining their motivation remotely. Many teachers get into the profession because they see it as a way of addressing longstanding inequalities in our societies. And for teachers with that orientation, it's just been devastating to watch inequalities expand, be revealed and expand. In the United States, we have a very, very poor, a really terrible, embarrassing social safety net for children and families with young children. And our schools took on enormous roles in feeding children, in providing frontline healthcare, and providing frontline mental health care, in all kinds of responsibilities that really in providing technology access for families, all kinds of responsibilities that parts of the state should take care of, but not school systems. In addition to trying to do teaching and learning, many, many teachers were trying to do all other kinds of social welfare on top of everything else they had to do with their own families. And then, it's really hard for master teachers who developed, 10, 15, 20 years of professional experience to feel like they're novices again. And teachers are just world historically tired right now. I have a few other things that we could talk about, but my time is short here. Maybe I'll say 2 things. One is for anyone who is a system level leader right now, I just cannot encourage you enough to spend some time actually talking to students and teachers and listening to them about their experiences. As we've talked to teachers, what they describe as their experiences, as their plans for the future, is just nothing like what we hear national global policymakers talk about. The dominant narrative of the pandemic from a sort of policy point of view is something like, there wasn't sufficient progress in standards aligned curriculum this year, which is leading to this learning loss, these learning gaps. And so the focus of next year, in addition to some amount of community building and, renorming, it needs to be on, high dosage tutoring, the use of standardized tests to identify gaps in content learning that can be remediated through tutoring or other kinds of things. We just cannot find students or teachers for whom that narrative feels relevant. We cannot find students or teachers who, when they discuss their experiences this year, there are many, many students we've talked about. I'll give you some links of some other research to look at. Students who are sort of vigorously opposed to this learning loss narrative, who are adamant that they should be recognized for the work and the effort that they've put into this year. When we ask teachers to talk to their students, there are just 0 of them, and we've tried to hear back from hundreds. There are 0 of them who say the thing that I'm going to do next year is to use standardized tests to identify content gaps in my student learning and remediate it. So we have this sort of burgeoning policy framework developed by economists and quantitative researchers that leads to some kind of proposed intervention. And the people actually in classrooms on the ground, as far as we tell, just don't see themselves at all in that story. And it may be that the economists are right and that the teachers are wrong. But if you're advancing that policy narrative, you really need to figure out why there's so little response from classroom participants to that story. And then maybe I'll just close by saying, the last challenge that we face is that we're slowly transforming the geochemistry of our planet to be inhospitable to human civilization. And there's going to be more fires, more floods, more pandemics, more global disease events, more freezes. And very sadly, the pandemic is going to prove to be a trial run for schooling during the global emergency ahead. So one of the challenges we face is sort of learning from what we've done this year to think about what kinds of approaches should we build for a future in which interrupted schooling like we've experienced this year is just more common. I'll pause there and see if we want to have questions or turn it over to one of the next speakers.
Thank you so much. I have so many questions and so many things I'd like to comment on with what you've talked about, but I think I'll wait till the end when we have our Q&A session. Very informative. I have a homeschooled daughter, so exactly what you're talking about is very interesting to me. We'll go on to the next speaker, if that's okay, who is Dr. Harris, who's a professor at Swansea University School of Education. And Dr. Harris today is going to be talking about school leadership during this time. So we're still continuing with information about stakeholders and their roles, but we're going to be talking about school leadership. And Dr. Harris has written extensively on this topic, on middle leadership, and also she has worked as a consultant for the World Bank. So Dr. Harris, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Jenny, and thanks for this opportunity to talk to you. I found that absolutely fascinating, the previous speaker's analysis of what's happening. And I think one of the things we've got to avoid at all costs is the idea of a learning loss. And maybe we should focus on what learners have gained rather than what they have lost. And maybe that's a much better discourse than the deficit one that talks about loss. I also want to connect with Christina's work on parents, because I'm going to be talking a little bit about leaders and the role that they play in this pandemic, but also the role they play with their communities, with their parents, with their students. And again, I was struck by what Justin said about system leaders and the way in which the policy discourse and the leadership of those policies has taken us into a direction which largely could be counterproductive for a system trying to learn its way through a pandemic. So essentially, today I'm going to be talking about leadership, and I'm going to be talking about leadership really in relation to the school. I'm going to be talking about school leadership in particular. Okay. So there are sort of three questions that I want us to consider. And the first is about, the role of students, teachers, and families during remote learning, and what happens in schools, and what happens between leaders and their communities during a pandemic like this one. Justin also talked about the challenges related to student learning, and there are huge challenges, and I completely take on board what he said about the availability of apps and the many different ways in which students are trying to connect with schools. And I love the idea of failure to disrupt, because I think he's absolutely right about that. But I think we need to think a little bit about our schools, because if our teachers are tired, then our leaders are even more tired, because they've been doing the lion's share of the work in keeping the school operating, keeping teachers functioning, keeping students learning. One of the things we know about school leadership is that it makes a considerable difference when it is effective to learner outcomes. And I think what we've learned through this pandemic is that leadership becomes even more important in a pandemic like this, where there are no very clear routes through, there are no blueprints, there are no maps to follow. In a sense, every single leader, whether they're in a school or at a different level, were trying to solve problems at the rapid rate of speed that they appeared. So leadership has changed, in my view, quite dramatically during the pandemic, and I'll say a little bit more about that as I go through the presentation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the challenges for school leaders and what we know. And also I'm going to come back to Christina's presentation about the importance of school leaders now working with teachers and the wider community. The other thing we know from the evidence base, of course, is that when parents engage in schooling and learning, then the effects can be dramatic. Now, there's a difference between involvement and engagement, and that's not just a matter of semantics. It's actually saying when parents engage in student learning, either in the home or in the school or in both of those places, then the effect can be quite dramatic and quite powerful. So we know that leadership is a very important lever to pull in terms of school improvement, school effectiveness, system performance. And we know that parents and community play a pivotal role, bearing in mind, of course, that not all communities are the same, not all parents are the same, not all homes are the same. And therefore that issue of equity that Justin raised is really important to think about, because it's not a level playing field. So therefore we need to think about the differentiated approach that we put in place to support learners and parents in different circumstances. It is clear that there's a strong relationship. I mean, what I've done in this presentation and in the paper is to take a look at the evidence, because in a sense, the evidence on COVID and the way schools have operated is just emerging. We were literally flying the plane as we were building it as researchers, trying to understand what was happening in the school context. But one of the things we know from the broader research evidence is that the link between school leaders and stakeholders is absolutely critical. And in a way, that relationship will define a school's effectiveness and its performance, because the closer that bond, the better the school performs. And that's really irrespective of socioeconomic context, because parents, families engaging with teachers around student learning is probably the most powerful thing that we can do. So the evidence also underlines the centrality of stakeholder engagement. So in other words, it's not a nice thing to do and a peripheral thing to do, it's an absolutely central thing to do. So of all the things we have in our school improvement armory, engaging with stakeholders is probably the best thing that we could do. And it's easy to say, but it's very hard to do. It takes energy, it takes commitment, it takes time. There are different constituent parts. So I'm not for any moment saying that this is easy, but the benefits of it, when we get it right, are quite substantial. And I think the final bit of research that I want to point to is the student gains. In other words, when there is a very clear engagement with stakeholders, you can see quite profound and positive impacts on students' attainment and achievement, particularly during periods of remote learning. And I'll come to that in a moment, because again, the evidence base isn't vast. We don't have 20, 30 years. We have just over a year of evidence about what happens. But what we're seeing is that relationship is even more powerful and even more, I guess, impactful during times of remote learning like COVID, but not obviously not just COVID. So a couple of things, I guess, to highlight. When I looked at the evidence on leadership during COVID times or leadership during the pandemic, and I distilled it down, there were 7 key themes that came out absolutely consistently from the evidence. And I'll just touch upon some of these because I think it's important to see the leader in context. It's important to see the leader as a human being in the middle of a pandemic. And as someone who personally, as Justin said, you know, everybody's experience of the pandemic is different. So leaders are not immune to the impact of the pandemic, the worry, the concern, the pressure, the unpredictability, the chaos, all of that seems to amalgamate around a school leader because ultimately they are in charge. Ultimately, they are the responsible person in the organization. So a couple of things to say. I mean, one of the bits of evidence that comes out very strongly is that leaders, and my guess is teachers exactly the same, have felt under considerable pressure. And that pressure has been relentless. And that pressure is still there as we moved in and out of returning to school and then not being in school and then back into school again. And I think what we can't underestimate is, and this is related, the emotional stress that that's caused in our various systems. Continued stress causes all sorts of mental health issues. So what we're seeing in our leaders is an acute sense of stress and being under pressure and issues of well-being and mental health. Because ultimately, you know, inside the school, whatever sort of leader you are, you're still a human being and you're still experiencing your own life events as part of this pandemic. So I think the big thing that's happened in terms of the evidence base on leadership is we've moved well-being and leaders' mental health right to the top of the agenda. Because unless we can deal with that, it becomes almost impossible to deal with the other things around that leader in that school and to improve the quality of learning and teaching. We've also seen that leaders have been incredibly adaptive because they haven't had the blueprint, they haven't had, I guess, the file of what to do. They've had to really make it up on the spot and adapt their leadership to the context that they've found themselves in. If you think before the pandemic, you know, leadership was a pretty predictable activity in schools. And then suddenly overnight, it became the most unpredictable activity. So the fourth part of this is about personal resistance. And what you find is that we've seen examples of head teachers, principals, other leaders in other parts of the system demonstrating incredible personal resilience. And I mean, that's one of the characteristics of an effective leader, of course, we know that. But in terms of the pandemic, that resilience, not just for leaders, but teachers, students, all of us actually, has been the difference between sinking or swimming. One of the things, again, that Justin highlighted, and I'm so glad he went before me, was the issue of equity, because COVID-19 has now blown open the fact that we knew there were inequities in our education systems. OECD has said this for many years, and UNESCO knows this. But I think in a way, what COVID-19 has done is it's put that into the spotlight in a way that we cannot ignore it any longer. And so leaders are now not necessarily leading their schools, but they're leading for equity. And that's a very different proposition. And it's an important imperative, of course, so equity. But if I can take you to the last 2 points, and this is where you've got the stakeholder engagement. Leaders who've been successful during COVID times and have managed to keep their school together, have managed to keep teaching and learning happening, albeit in variable ways, having managed to reach out to families and the wider community. And they've done so in ways that have been both empowering, but also in ways that have been very productive. So that's the point I made earlier. It isn't just about involvement, because we can all cooperate. It's actually about deep collaboration and deep engagement. And the final point I wanted to make is that what we're seeing is dramatically changing leadership practices. We're seeing different forms of leadership in our schools, different forms of leadership in our systems, as we start to respond to the aftermath well, let's hope so, the aftermath of COVID-19. But the unpredictability is the only predictability we've got right now. So for leaders, changing their leadership practices, adapting, adopting, trialing different things is in their armory of what they have available. In some respects, the old models of leadership have just fallen away because they're no longer fit for purpose in a COVID-19 and post-COVID-19 world. So what have we learned about what families need during remote learning? So I've talked about the importance of family engagement, and other people have talked about the importance of parents and the wider family and the wider community. Well, again, the evidence points to 4 things. There's a need for academic support, absolutely. You know, the learning has to continue, and therefore the leaders have to support the pedagogical processes. But there's also a point about reassurance that things are going in the right direction, even though it's not the direction that anyone planned. And I think that reassurance from the leader is a key constituent in the success of the school. You know, just simply reassuring young people and their parents that learning is taking place. It may be different learning, but it is still taking place, and everybody is really on board in terms of ensuring that that continuous learning happens. Some families have needed technological support in the sense of having, you know, I talked about equity before. We can't assume that everyone's got access to internet or to smartphones or iPads. And again, what we've seen is differences in access to technology. And therefore, the school has played a pivotal role in many cases, and leaders have played a pivotal role in ensuring that everybody's got the same technological resources to hand, and sort of evening out that inequity has been part of the technological support that's been provided by schools and recognised by leaders in our schools. Physical support. Sometimes our families and communities have needed active physical support with some of the issues that they're dealing with. So specialists from schools, for example, might have simply been offering, you know, mental health support, well-being support, guidance, counselling. Again, part of that reassurance. And what we also know is interpersonal support is key. We've all needed it during this pandemic. It's probably been the most important thing that we've all needed, is the recognition that there are still people out there and that we can connect with people and have their support during what's been one of the most challenging times. So in terms of some of the challenges that we've found, you know, for space to work, having connectivity, competing demands on their time. And I think in the future, we're probably going to see a lot of research that unpacks this a little bit more and talks about the real challenges, like a lack of routine. It's very hard to get into a routine when you're working at home. You know, the disconnect that Justin's talked about between teachers and friends, you know, that you're in this twilight zone where you are connecting online, but you're not connecting in exactly the same way. And I guess, you know, the research has also pointed to apathy and boredom. Doing the same things online, you know, the same apps is as frustrating and as boring as doing the same tasks in classrooms. There's nothing makes it more interesting because it's an app. What makes it interesting is the task. So the engagement of students with their peers and with their teachers is critically important. We know that. But in this COVID world, these are some of the experiences that young people have been having and have basically talked about. There are no easy answers to solving this problem, but I think that, again, the literature is beginning to point to some of the things that we're finding will work to engage students and will alleviate some of that boredom and apathy and some of the mental issues that some young people are facing. And I think it's not rocket science in the sense that it's about regular communication, checking in with students. And a variety in the digital diet. I mean, I'm probably, pretty fed up, like you all are, of Zooms and Teams, and it just isn't variable enough in terms of a mode of interaction. And whatever this pandemic has brought, it should not have brought less imaginative teaching. And I think, what we have to do if we think about going into remote learning for long periods again, is to really grapple with what would imaginative teaching look like? What would innovative teaching look like? Let's not be constrained by the apps or Zoom or Teams. And I think that's the real challenge going forward. That's the real pedagogical challenge, is how do we bring innovation, creativity, imagination back into two-dimensional learning or learning digitally. That's the real challenge. And then if we can succeed at that, we can get students engaged more with an online provision. A couple of other things just to say. The evidence, how can school leaders work with teachers and families to establish better quality learning environments? And again, I think the evidence points to the importance of family engagement that goes way beyond routine involvement and support. And I've already said that. It's the quality of the engagement in learning, not the quality of involvement in schools. We might need both of those things, but they are distinctively different in what they bring. And I guess the other point is that when students receive structured support from learning and home that is congruent, not different, but congruent, their learning can be quite dramatic, and the improvements in their learning can be quite dramatic. So Jenny, just checking how much time I've got left.
1 minute.
Okay, I will be very quick. So, I mean, to end on some policy recommendation, because you could ask the question, well, where does all this take us? And I'm not going to labor the points, because I think you've got access to the PowerPoint and to the paper. But somehow we need to incentivize family engagement, community engagement, parental engagement way more than we have to date. Because I think everything we've learned during COVID-19 would say that that is really important. And we shouldn't just leave it to chance, that we should have policies that reinforce community and family engagement in ways that support young people's learning wherever they are, whatever their context, whatever their needs. So I'll finish there, Jenny. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Harris. It was really interesting and informative. I really liked the part where you said, let's focus on some of the benefits. And it's definitely a time of transition. I would think that maybe in the end, we will come out on the other side in a much better place than with some of this technology. So, okay, great. So thank you again. Our next presenter is Dr. Chow, who is a professor and an associate director at the Research Center for Higher Education at Southern University of Science and Technology. He is also a senior program specialist at International Center for Higher Education Innovation. And he works with UNESCO quite a bit. He's also worked in, at least in the UK, Africa, and China. And he's going to be talking to us about the community and how the community can support learners during these times. Okay, Dr. Chow, I'm going to go on and give it over to you.
Hello. I'm sorry, just to mute my mic. So very happy to join you. My presentation is focused on the community roles for online learning during COVID-19. So I think community is playing quite critical roles when the students, they have to stay at home. They get some support from them. So this some reasons we to do the works we related to that. So for my presentation, I'd like to share some the data with you. So this is the Johns Hopkins University's the new the COVID-19 data. I think most of us we may be interested in that, and we also notice the new date every day they have update. I think the COVID-19 still very serious to our society. This UNESCO the data it also showed that the April 11, 2020. So that day is most worst day. We can see here. I think that I've got some. No, I got the pain. Okay, no. From this number, you can see the affected learners. This significant, and also the percentage of total enrolled learners have stopped to learn. And this is the new data, this update by 22nd May. So this is very new. We can see all the situation is quite better now. But supporting the students, they have to stop to learn in campus and all schools. So the UNESCO gives some response. I think UNESCO working a lot for support the learners who have to learn from home. Like here, UNESCO to fully committed to supporting government for distance learning, open sciences, knowledge and culture sharing. I think all that is a fundamental means to stand together and tighten the bonds of our shared humanities. And I think, for the effort from us, I think last March is a very serious situation to us as well. I think in that day, a lot of the students, they have to stay at home and they have no opportunity to go to the schools because their the situation like very serious. So for us, our team, we're working with other the colleagues in China. Actually, we also the colleagues from IHT and SUSTEC. IHT, we call it the International Center for Higher Education Innovation. SUSTEC is Southern University of Science and Technology. So the teams, we all working together and to create the guidance. We have 5 guidance published, and to this to working for them for almost 1.5 a month. So I think this 5 guidance actually for students, for teachers, and for principal and education. For education, educational administrator, and also parents and communities, and the technology and the platforms. So I think for them, we creating a scenario. We want to offer our, the support to them. These all the stakeholders who related to learning and teaching online for our students, all support to our students. In this guidance, we to share our experience and the resources, how to give our support to students learn from home. Actually, we have 3 versions. The first version we have English version, Chinese version, and also French version. So all these 5 guidance initiated by SUSTEC and the UNESCO IITE, and also co-developed by UNESCO ECHI and also UNESCO INRLAD. The working team, we have the team in our center, UNESCO EGI, and also the UNESCO ITE, and also SUSTEC in my university, and also some colleagues from Southern University of Science and Technology, and SCTU, Guangzhou University, so far. So that's a list of them. And this work is supported by Chinese Netcom for UNESCO. So the purposes for publishing the guidance, we, just to give a brief introduce for it. So I think we from our the position, we see the serious situation, how to support our the students when they learn from home. So we have to know who can to engage in online learning. So around the students, and also we want to share our experience and support to the global situation. And also we want to offer the online technology preparation tips, instructional strategies, and online learning, online teaching, learning and assessment approaches, resources and cases to facilitate the quality online education. So I think these five guidance can be downloaded from the URL. So ioe.org/library. So you can download that if you're interested. But for we focus on the community role. So what the community can do for supporting students learning online during COVID-19. So I think this environment for online learning for students, this is the students. There's some other stakeholders related to students. We analyze the student situation. We can see the parents, the teachers, the education managers, and also technicians, communities, OERs, and video conferencing, communication tools. And all these the elements can be supported by the online learning platform. So we have many kind of platforms now we can be used. So just other presenters already shared their the technological the we use with us. Because the students, they have stay at home, so they connect with others like teacher, the parents, not parents, other students, the stay at home, but through internet. I think this environment to help us to think about the situation, and then we want to offer the support from these different stakeholders. So the guidance for parents and the communities, actually we connected the parents and the community together. So we think about from this guidance, we want to to how to create an ideal learning environment for parents. So because parents, they stay with their kid, so they are students as well. So so what kind of the ideal learning environment for them? So I that's very interested. The Justin shared the interest-driven learning. I think that's a very good idea, because the student, they have to interested to learn, and also how to create good online the learning condition. I mean, the students, they have the some elements that they influence impact to them. So they need to have a very good ensure they can to learn at home, and also how to assist in supervising students' learning process. This may parents to do that, and also to pay attention to students' mental health. I think this also a critical issue as well. How to help students to develop the good learning habit, and also to obtain the good learning resources. Because the situation changed, the students study or learn, at home. So this is really different from the school environment. So the students, the learning habit, how can adapt to this new situation. So I think their parents need their effort to support that. And also the community, how community provide a good environment for online learning, and also ensuring network, power supply, and also epidemic safety monitoring. This is for like the pandemic, they come to outbreak from their local the community. So this is also need the community's effort. And also in guidance, we have the frequent asking questions. This is the structure for the community engagement for the guidance. So we here we introduce some the readiness for online learning. So include the technology, environment, learning online, digital learning resources, something include that. And we have the chapters, chapter by chapter, step by step, we to offer the experience here. I don't introduce them more, but I just to say the structure is quite important for the community, the people who are interested in that. I also want to make sure they can to use those experiences. They can to be use it, apply them in their working to fighting the COVID-19. So what can community do? I think for community, I think this situation really also diverse, country by country, place by place, and also district by district. So, but there's some common common issue we try to suggest that the community to think about. They can do them. So like the committee can provide a favorable the community environment for online learning. So this like the environment is can to ensure the students in the community to learn online comfortable. So like we can to prevent the gathering the residents or students through circulate the information concerning disease containment, and also minimizing noisy. I think this, in the COVID-19 the situation, this for communities maybe sometimes very different from that. So they may, to create the new rules or norm for ensure the people who living there. And also working with the community residents to create the supportive environment for children so that they could have good learning experience. So they have, would have in school. I think this is also quite important because students, when they stay in schools, they have different situation, but go back to the home. So they stay in the community. So how the community, to ensure the environment can support, all the students who live in that community as well. So if possible, provide regular service for students as dictionary, procurement and document printing. But this, some paperwork they need to get more like the support from locally. So the second suggestion is to ensure stable network connection. But this may be not to the communities, the working their duties. But sometimes when COVID-19, that's a very serious situation. So the technician may not go to the, freely. So the community may can to undertake this work. So so the community may have the rules to ensure the network connection stability in the communities to prevent the download or upload or running conferencing time. I think this is also quite important as well. Sometimes, for the some other countries, maybe their network is not very good. So if they cannot working through network, so the students may difficult to learn through online. But also in the case of emergency downtime, so notify the parents and initiate the contingency plan. And also the power supply. This also the committee's the efforts they can to help all the the people who live in there make sure that the power supplies. And also in case of emergency downtime, notify parents and initiate the contingency plan. Okay, so the more work for community to monitor community safety during the epidemic. So we, to check the body temperature with the visitors at all community entrances, just like the community shut down and all the people they get in or out, so they get some the check, and also prevented and disperse gathering. All this work is to protecting and fighting the virus. So this committee can, they can do that very well. Okay, I think we may have more suggestions, but for in last April last year, so I think in that beginning for the pandemic emerging, so we have a lot of the work to do. I think for community, we can to share our experience how to ensure the community engaged in all the to help our students who learn at home to have a good learning environment, and to make sure they can to learn very well when they stay at home. Okay, I think this my some viewpoint and also perspective from our guidance and our experience in working with the communities. But I also want to in the last I want to share some of our effort to from ECHI, the International Center on Higher Education Innovation. So the IOE's effort on supporting capacity building for college teachers, I think this is a little bit different, but just to introduce our work. So the IOE actually they initiated by UNESCO ECHI together with ITS its partner HEIs and also enterprises in Africa and Africa Pacific countries. So the IOE aims to enhance the capacity of partner HEIs, higher education institutions, in developing countries and expand access to quality higher education. So this is some character of IOE. To see that. Okay, so what's IOE actually the meaning International Institute of Online Education. So IOE is supporting to supporting teachers' development, also to provide the training for capacity building and offering the quality online courses. Also share some powerful, the online tool, and also networking with the partners. So I think not to, limited on those the work we have done, but also we have others, to related to all the works about that. So like IOE now, they actually through that website, we offering a lot of cutting edge courses for teachers capacity building. This is, if you're going to online to this website, you can see a lot of the courses there. But I think all the courses is cutting edge, like for the higher technology. So I don't to introduce them too much, but just to list them here. You can just have a look. So we have partner universities about IOE. So this distributed in the Africa and Asia Pacific area, and also yes, like in Middle East and also the East Europe area. So these are all the partner university. But we also have partner the enterprises like the I think most of them is quite well known the company in China. But covered by from the artificial intelligence, computer, and also the the education resources. Okay, so so the last but not least, so the lessons we learned from IOE. So I think online education is becoming the mainstream and also the new norm for global universities, but not limited to university, but to the schools as well. Also, university networking. I think based on the work, we can do creating the partnership upon, among university, more help. And also experience of higher education development from developed countries could help developing countries. This is also another experience. So sharing and cooperation are the fundamental issue for higher education internalization. And UNESCO can play a critical role for creating this kind of global network. Okay, so thank you very much. I just to stop now. I don't know the time.
Hi, yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Chow.
Okay, I'll stop my share.
Yeah, please. Okay, so this is time for the question and answers, I guess. So if anyone has any questions, we've had a few comments and a question that came through, but I would like to ask a question. In one of the presentations, it was suggested that there are some students who do well in this sort of format, online format. What do you think are there any shared characteristics of the students that do well? Do we know yet?
I can answer a few of those things, although I would say we don't know very well yet. Thriving in most forms of online learning requires a lot of internal motivation, a lot of self-directed learning skills. And so I think there are students who find, schools constraining environments. You sort of go from one 47-minute class period to the next, and there are some learners who found that they liked having more control over their time and organizing of their day. There are lots of students too who find school to be pretty hostile places, either because they have social anxiety or experience bullying, or they experience some kind of racism or discrimination or bigotry at school. In the United States, there's an observation of a number of Black students who found that being home in the loving arms of their family was better than being in some of the schools they attended. But a bunch of those things kind of have to overlap. You probably have to have some sort of aversion to school for one reason or another, high levels of internal motivation around learning, a bunch of supports at home so that the learning feels feasible, a few of those things lining up. I mean, we're probably talking about something like, nobody really knows, but 10% of learners or something like that, probably fewer among younger learners, and maybe that amount or a little higher among secondary school students.
So on to another follow-up question to that is that, could you in the future see like a menu? I mean, I know some schools have this to a certain degree, like with homeschooling. Could you see, or what would be the obstacles to this, where there's kind of a menu of classes that certain students could take at home, and then also take, maybe more interactive classes at school. Maybe like theater or something where it would really help their social skills, but for that content support, they could do it at home.
You know, the number one obstacle thus far has been the performance of virtual schools, at least in the United States, is shockingly bad. Students who enroll in these sort of full-time virtual schools, you know, in state after state, we have studies that they perform worse, and sometimes worse in an ongoing way for multiple years. So building the environments in which people have really high quality online learning experiences for younger folks seems to be really, really hard. There are also all kinds of sort of bureaucratic and kind of structural challenges around that, you know, building, we you know, in some places we have something along the lines of school choice, you know, you can go to this school or that school. It's a lot harder to imagine how you would build systems in which you choose certain kinds of classes from some providers, certain kinds of learning experiences from other kinds of providers. And, you know, there's also some sense that, you know, when people talk about technology, they often get really interested in thinking about, well, like, how can I sort of individually optimize the experience for each individual learner? But that's only part of the purpose of schools. A huge part of the purpose of schools is to build some kind of shared community. And if everyone is off kind of doing their own thing at their own time in their own different direction, then even, you know, those individual benefits may not match up with what's lost from not having that shared community.
Okay, great. And this is a question that was asked from the community. And I also have, in addition to that, and I think anyone could answer this, it's like, what sort of support is given to maybe paraeducators or people who are not necessarily teachers, and also parents at home that might have a fear of technology? Because if we're talking, you know, like parents are learning coaches, and that's a really big predictor to success. So what kind of support should there be for parents to learn the technology?
I think I touched upon this in what I said, Jenny, that it's hard for parents because they're differentiated to universally support students, because they'll need support themselves in order to support students in ways that actually enhance learning. So there's no sort of simple answer to the question other than to say what I said before, you know, technical support, interpersonal support, maybe some resources in terms of, you know, supporting the resources. But ultimately, I think that everything we know about parental engagement is that it becomes better, stronger, more impactful if there are clear ways of supporting parents to support their children, whatever the learning environment.
Okay.
So for
and
me,
then
I
the question,
think, sorry, Jenny.
go ahead. Yeah.
I think I have one suggestion. I think maybe, you know, for community, you know, when parents, they need some support, like the technologies or some other, the knowledge like psychological, you know, the knowledge they want to help the children. So I think the community may come working with some professional institutions. So they to create some online course to offer to the parents. So this would help. You know, I think a lot of experience when you know, in this very worst situation. So we can to share, if you know, the community can to share some the experience with us, that would be more help.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, I'm just going to say some of the questions that have come through. And this is one for Dr. Harris. What kind of support is given for the other support teaching staff? So do you have anything to add to that?
Well, only to say that support staff in our schools play a critical role because they tend to know children far better than perhaps some teachers do. So I think we can't underestimate the role of teaching assistants, support staff within schools. And yes, they would need exactly the same support as anyone else working professionally. But in terms of engagement with the community, often it's the support staff in schools have that pivotal relationship with the community because often they come from that community. So yeah, I just agree that support staff are critically important in all this.
right, I think that's about all the questions that we have. Anybody have any other comments that they want to make? Or well, thank you again. Thanks to everybody for your presentations and everyone for attending session 2 and all of you who have been here through session 1 as well and the presenters. Thank you again, and it was a great session. Have a great day, no matter where you're at.
Thank you, everyone. I'm attending the final session from my car. The last 10 minutes from my car, and I would like to thank our experts for their presenting and sharing their knowledge with us. And I hope to see them in other seminars and activity with the Regional Center of Education Planning.